This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're going to be talking about Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. And today I want to talk about sort of 5 big picture takeaways from this early stage of the format. I'm not quite at the point where I'm ready to start looking at cards that I'm know I was wrong about yet. I'll get there by next week, but for now, I do think there's some big picture things that I want to share with you to help you do better in this new limited format. So first up is that the set really feels like a core set. What that means generally is that it is less complex and less powerful than your typical limited set. It's not quite back to the same level as core sets, which tended to be very simple overall. Magic's complexity has gotten kind of out of hand of late. And even this set, which dials a lot of that back, is still a lot more complicated than a core set might have been. But it is a lot simpler, and that matters for a number of reasons. With the set being less powerful, that really matters too. I mean, looking at the bombs in the set, there are a few that are kind of unanswerable and you may as well give up, like Witch King of Angmar and stuff like that. But most of the bombs in this set can be answered relatively easily by common removal. And I think that's a really good thing overall. Basically, I guess what I'm saying, part of it being a core set and feeling like a core set is that it is a pauper set, in the sense that you don't have to have powerful rares and mythics to do well. You can answer most of your opponent's rares and mythics with like a 3-mana black removal spell at common. So that's a good thing. This also means generally that synergy isn't as big as usual, and I do think that's the case overall. There's some exceptions, like the Scry deck generally is super synergistic, but most of the decks in the format have more of a sub-theme related to their synergy than they do this sort of like overwhelming critical mass of synergy that you have to reach or your deck's just not going to function. So in a lot of ways, it's more forgiving in the limited format. If you don't pick up synergy, you can still do relatively well. There basically aren't as many situations that feel miserable and unwinnable in this format as there have been or as there can be in other formats. Overall, I think the fact that it feels like a core set is good. I think it's especially good in the short term. In the long term, things can kind of get less interesting in a set that feels a little too much like a core set. But we'll see if things actually end up there. The second takeaway, and it's kind of related, is that the format is not very fast. I mean, right now I feel like I'd say that it's like medium slow, which is to say, like if medium's right in the middle, fast is a format where you have to have lots of 1s and 2 drops, and slow is a format where, you basically don't have to play anything and be worried about anything till like turn 4. It's somewhere in the middle, but leaning a little bit in the slow direction. And what I mean by that is, this is a format where if you don't get on board on turn 1 or 2, it is not a catastrophe like it has been in most limited sets lately. There are exceptions. The red-white deck in this format can run you over, but it's not every deck in the set. You don't always have to be prepared for that like you do in most limited formats over the last year or so, where you had to have 1 and 2 drops, especially 2 drops. You still want them, but they aren't as valuable as they've been lately. Like just something being cheap and okay isn't as important. You still want 2 drops. You still do want to add to the board when you can, but you can do reasonably well in this format with slower decks. And the good news about this is that a lot of the cards that, look kind of questionable because maybe they don't add to the board. This is true of sagas, especially. Like Tale of Tenuviel has been better than I expected because my problem with it is that it doesn't really do anything until chapter 2. Similarly, the Bath Song has been better than I expected. Like these cards that just generate value and may not impact the board or take too long in most formats to impact the board, they kind of work out here. You can grind out value from cards like that because your opponent's much less likely to have this insane curve out that runs you over that you just can't recover from no matter what you do. So in general, things like card draw spells, anything that doesn't add to the board but builds a long-term advantage is better in this format than it has been in the recent past. Third big takeaway, fixing is pretty good, especially if you're in green. Green has access to lots of quality fixing, but in general, the set has pretty good fixing. It does depend to some degree what color you're in, but even outside of green, red has a common that makes a treasure. There is the Shire Terrace land, which is really nice fixing to have around. So splashing a third color really isn't that difficult in this format, and sometimes you can have, something that's pretty close to a full-on 3-color deck, but you do usually need to be base green if you're going that full-on 3-color, or, get several copies of the 3-mana Amass to make a treasure card if you're in red. Like, that card does do some serious work, and it's a pretty nice common in general. Another big takeaway is, and I already alluded to this a little bit, but the Scry deck can be really, really good. I think it has the highest ceiling of any deck in the format. It's really impressed me so far. Going into this set, I was pretty high on it because, Scry itself is about helping you do better in the game by getting rid of cards from the top of your deck that you don't want and making sure that there are cards on top of your deck that you do want. And that in itself is already inherently powerful. But then they jammed all of these mostly uncommon Scry payoffs into the set that are incredibly good. You have Arwen and Domiel. You have the one generic and a blue, draw a card, and then you just exile it from your graveyard to draw another card later when you scry. I mean, even the common Scry payoff, the 3-mana 3/2 that gets a counter when you scry, these things have all been very nice payoffs to have when you're already doing something that helps you out a significant amount and helps you find more synergy. So this deck can be really impressive. It does seem to me like it's the kind of deck, because the best payoffs are largely uncommon or rare even, that once the word is out on it more, it might become harder to draft. But right now, I mean, I think there's enough going around with the deck that two drafters at a table can usually support it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's the deck to beat in the format right now. But I do think as people move in the direction of, okay, this Scry deck is nuts, it's going to be harder to draft, because if you're just relying on like the common Scry payoffs, your deck's not going to be great. And the last big takeaway is that overall, the Ring Tempts You is pretty mediocre. That's the last takeaway here. It is upside, don't get me wrong, and they've tacked it onto a bunch of cards that are already pretty good, like, 1 red mana, do 2 damage to something, the Ring Tempts You. Like, that's great. And the upside does matter. But, I wasn't incredibly high on it in the set review to begin with, in terms of how I thought it would pan out, but I thought it was going to be better than it has been. It does upgrade your creatures, but the benefits it gives you, especially the first 3 levels, they don't always matter. Like, the most important one oftentimes is chapter 1, because it turns on your legendary payoffs and stuff like that. Like, that's often the most important one there is. I said it was a chapter, but you know what I mean. The first level, the second level, looting is nice. It's, a nice effect to tack on. And then the third level, destroying things that block your ring bearer. Like, going into the set, I thought that was such a weird thing to include on a card that also gave your creature evasion, and that has played out that way. It's a very weird ability. But then chapter 4 is the nice one, or level 4, whatever you want to call it. Once you get to the last one and you have it on this like nice evasive creature, that can be pretty good. But I would say the value you generate from the Ring Tempts You, like, oftentimes we think about these things in regard to like, how close is it to draw a card? And I don't think it's even close to drawing a card. Like, I don't know. It's probably somewhere between like Scry 1 and Scry 2 is probably like the value. It's hard to ascribe an exact value to something like this because it's different, but I'm trying to give it to you in the context of an evergreen mechanic that you are very used to seeing. And largely, the Ring Tempts You is okay, but it hasn't been that good. It's maybe a quarter of a card, if we want to call it that, in terms of value it generates. It's fine, and I think it's a cool mechanic. It goes really well in the set. It does glue some of the set together in terms of some of the synergy. Having a legendary creature matters, drawing cards matters. I think the biggest problem with it, honestly, is the third level, which just seems so out of place compared to what the rest of the card is doing. Like, And I think, I would bet that they had something that made more sense in the context of this making a creature evasive originally, but maybe it turned out to be too good, and they were like, well, let's make it, do something that's kind of weird regarding, when you're trying to attack with an evasive creature. The upside about that is you can move, obviously, if you get tempted by the ring, you can move it to something that your opponent does want to block. But most of the time, if that's true, your opponent, if they want to block, it's going to be a trade or a chump anyway, right? So the whole thing is weird. And I think it's really the third level that really deflates how good the Ring Tempts You is. And, I sort of worked this out while I'm saying this out loud, but I think that really is what it is. But, it is upside. It's tacked onto lots of cards that are good anyway. I'm not saying avoid all the cards that say the Ring Tempts You on them. Just, scale back a little bit on how good you feel like it is. I know I've had to do that so far in the format. All right, so those are the 5 big takeaways from the format so far. Let's do a crack-a-pack now. As usual, show you a pack one, pick one situation. We will talk about, the cards in the pack, and I'll give you my thoughts about each of these cards at this early stage of the format, and we'll eventually decide what we're going to first pick. All right, our first common is Uruk-hai Berserker. So this is a 3-mana 3/2. The Ring Tempts You when it enters the battlefield. This thing's fine, but like I was just discussing, it has been, a little bit worse than I expected, like most of the Ring Tempts You effects are. And this is one that's not tacked onto a card that's already pretty good. It's just fine. The fact that it's an orc matters. I mentioned blue-green being pretty synergistic. Red-black often is too. And this creature type certainly matters. And the Ring Tempting You, sometimes you can play this on turn 3, make your 1-drop or 2-drop into a Ring Bearer, and now it can attack through an opponent's creature. Like, that's fine. It's just nothing special. Certainly not something you ever want to first pick. Elven Farsight is next. I was pretty high on this going into the format, at least for a 1-mana card draw spell that doesn't impact the board at all. And I'm still pretty high on it. 1-mana, Scry 3, draw a card is basically what it ends up being. Most of your decks are going to have enough creatures to set this up easily. Scrying is valuable in the format for reasons, that are based on synergy in the format and not just because scrying is good in the first place. So this card's been nice. It's still not something I would want to first pick, though. Shire Terrace is next. This is another card I mentioned, in the main part of the video today. It's nice fixing. I wouldn't say, there's some formats where taking a really good fixing land with your first pick is something that you want to do with regularity. That's not true here. I didn't mean to convey that it is, but taking Shire Terrace over like a medium playable isn't a terrible idea, but there's going to be better things in it in the pack. Although right now, I might take it over the other 2 cards. Obviously, there's going to be more, though. We've got Isolation at Orthonk, or I guess as people keep telling me, it's Orthink. We've got that card next. It's a fine removal spell. It's not a perfect one, but the fact it's an instant is nice. It gets rid of armies sometimes, which is cool. Your opponent does eventually get the card back, but it is a 1-for-1 trade, and that's okay. I would probably take it here, but it's definitely not great. Next up, we've got Birthday Escape. So 1 blue mana, draw a card. The Ring Tempts You. This is one where the card already would be reasonably playable, partly because there's a spell deck, partly because there's a draw 2 cards in a turn deck. So adding the Ring Tempts You here is some pretty real value. I mean, I think you end up ultimately getting more than 1 mana of value out of this card. It's not 2 mana's worth of value. You don't feel like you got there, but replaces itself and gives you an effect, and that makes it fine. Makes the cut in a lot of blue decks, especially like blue, white, and blue, red, but Isolation at Orthink is definitely better. Deceive the Messenger is next. This has been pretty solid. It's kind of like Birthday Escape. It costs 1 mana, and it does 2 tiny little incremental things, but what you feel like you get out of it is often plenty. I mean, it's sort of a 1 mana, 1/1, that gives something -3/-0 until end of turn. Sometimes you can line it up where you already have an army and it's kind of like a combat trick and it lets your army kill their attacker out of nowhere. I've done that once or twice in the format. That feels great. It's not usually how it works out, but it does have that upside and its floor is fine. So, I would play it, but I think Isolation at Orthink is still better. Gimli's Axe is next. I have not been remotely impressed with this. I think I gave it a C- in the set review anyway, so it wasn't like I was high on it. But if anything, so far it's felt worse. It's another card, you could say, well, you're going to have legendary creatures because of the ring tempts you, and that's true. But this is another card that interacts in an awkward way with that. Sure, it gives the thing menace, but it also makes your ring bearer easier to block, which is kind of not what you want to do. So, it's definitely not what we take here. And I think of all the cards we've seen so far, it's the one I like the least. Mirror Mare Guardian, solid 3-drop. 3 mana 4/2 is a passable creature, and especially there's 3 or 4 commons and uncommons in green that really like it when you have 4 power, and this is basically the earliest way in the game you can do it. So that's nice, and then, getting some ring temps you value is fine. So far, these commons have been super underwhelming, though. I haven't seen a single one that I would feel good about first picking. Isolation at Orthanc is the only one that's close, I think. Took Reaper is next. Mediocre stats, but it dies. The ring tempts you. It's okay. It's a fine 2-drop, but I'm not particularly interested in it as a first pick. Still on Isolation. Haunt of the Dead Marshes. This card's been nice. There are enough little things you can do with it in terms of getting it back from your graveyard, sacrificing it for value, and so forth, that it's a card you end up playing in a lot of black decks. But all of these commons, like I said, not a one of them do I feel great about first picking. Isolation at Orthanc and Shire Terrace are the only ones that are in like the neighborhood of even being first pickable. We do have a good first uncommon, though. It's Council's Deliberation. I just mentioned this in the main part of the video. This is a really good Scry payoff. It draws you a card for 2 mana, which is not a good rate. But then later in the game, you can cash it in from your graveyard and draw a card for no additional mana, and that ends up being really good. And one of the nice things about it, unlike some of the other Scry payoffs in this set, is you can have like 3 cards with Scry in your deck, which if you're in any blue deck, you're probably going to have those. If you have those, this is very playable because, ideally you'd be able to trigger it as regularly as possible, but because it just sits in your graveyard, waiting until you get to 5 mana and play the 3/4 Scry 2 and then cashing this in is perfectly fine. You don't need to start building an advantage with it to make sure you really get things going. It just sits around and waits for you. So this is what I would first pick now. I mean, it's a 2-for-1. It's, I liked it in the set review, but it is a card that draws you cards, gives you a 2-for-1, doesn't impact the board at all, that benefits from the format not being as much about being on board as many of them lately have been. Our next uncommon is the Grey Havens. I haven't found occasion to play this. Like, I haven't had a deck where I thought it made sense to play this, and I haven't seen people play it. I think going into the set, I thought it was going to be kind of okay, because I thought early, sure, it only produces colorless, but then later in the game, it'll produce 1 or 2 colors, and, it can do that, but the fact it produces colorless only in the early game is a huge detriment to your mana base. So I think it's worse than I thought it was, and I mostly don't think you end up playing it. Our third uncommon is really bad too. It is Entdraft Basin. This thing, somebody said in the set review, they were like, that card looks like it was designed for Ice Age or something, like one of these really old sets where you're like, why did they design it this way? It's so bad. And that's a weird thing to have in a current Magic set. But there you have it. That is pretty much what Entdraft Basin is. It may not be entirely unplayable. If your deck has a bunch of 1/1 tokens, it gets a little bit interesting, but man, it's just so bad at buffing things, and that's a problem. Even in a format like this one that may be a little slower, spending a bunch of mana for 1 counter isn't really what you want to be doing. So this pack was pretty bad. We haven't even gotten to the rare yet, but these commons and uncommons have been bad. Council's Deliberation, Isolation at Orthanc, and Shire Terrace. It is interesting because the floor here isn't that bad. Like, Gimli's Axe is the worst card. I would play, the Grey Havens probably is, or the Entdraft Basin, actually. So 2 of the uncommons are probably the worst cards in the pack, followed by Gimli's Axe. Everything else is perfectly playable. It's just also not anything you're excited about. A rare, also not great. The red land in the rare land cycle enters untapped if you have a legendary creature. This one can generate some treasure for you and hate on the graveyard. No, it only exiles from your own graveyard. So your graveyard as fuel makes you some treasure. I think it's probably the least useful of all of these in Limited. There are some things you can do with it. It's a land that gives you fixing. Like, it's not terrible, but it's also not one of these that I feel that good about the idea of first picking. This pack's interesting too because there's a lot of good common removal in this format, and the best we could do was Isolation at or Think, and that, you know, that's kind of rough. But I guess it's Council's Deliberation. This was a weak pack overall. I think there's 2 cards in it that are nigh unplayable. Gimli's Axe, which I never feel good about, and then a bunch of medium stuff with some medium plus things like Isolation and Shire Terrace. And then you've got Council's Deliberation, the only card I feel legitimately good about having in my deck, like in this entire pack, that was a weak one. But those can be interesting in terms of discussion, you know, of the new format. So that will do it for this week's Nizzanotes. Like I said, I'll be back next week to start talking about 10 cards I got wrong in the format. By then, I think I'll be able to compile such a list. Until then, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see more of my Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth content, including draft videos, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.